Welcome to the Designing Hollywood podcast in association with the John Campea Show. I am your host, Robert Meyer Burnett. Today's episode is sponsored by International Silks and Woolens Fabric Store. Our guest today is an Emmy and CDGA Award-winning costume designer based in Los Angeles. She most recently designed the costumes for Netflix's comedy series Beef, starring Huang and Stephen Ewan, Apple TV's The Shrink Next Door, starring Will Ferrell and Paul Rudd, and HBO's Station 11, which I actually read the book for that before I saw the show, and it was great, starring Mackenzie Davis and Hamish Patel. In 2016, she won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Costumes for a Contemporary Series, and in 2017, she won the CDGA Award for Outstanding Contemporary Television Series for her work on American Horror Story Hotel. Her upcoming work can be seen on HBO's new series, The Penguin, set to release next year. Without further ado, please welcome costume designer Helen Huang back to the Designing Hollywood show. Helen, welcome to the show. It is great to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you so much.
So, you've done a lot of things that I've quite enjoyed. I mentioned to you earlier that you did Rim of the World that my friend Zach Stentz wrote.
Yes.
Now, I'm always curious, how did you find your way into the business? And was it something you always wanted to do? And I've always been curious about, did you take an academic road? Or I've heard many costume designers who told me they didn't start out to be a costume designer, but life kind of swept them into the industry. How did you find yourself here?
Well, I think it's the latter that I actually went to school for painting and illustration at Art Center in Los Angeles. I really didn't know that costume designing was like a job. But I got out of school in 2008 when the economy was pretty much just the bottom of the barrel. And it was very tough. And so I was working at a high-end jewelry store, and like Vogue would come in and pull all the time. And so I thought maybe I'll give that a shot, So I asked if I could intern there. I interned in Los Angeles. And then I did assisting on some editorial things. But I wasn't quite right just because, I don't know, there was something about it that I didn't really connect to. Fast forward, I started doing commercials with someone, assisting them, and then I met Deborah McGuire, who did Friends, and I basically emailed her for 2 years while I was getting into the union, every 6 months. I'm sure she thought I was such a bother. But then she hired me on a commercial, and then she hired me on a TV show. And as soon as I got into scripted television, I was like, oh, this is it. This is what I enjoy, I think mostly because I got into art and painting and things like that because I think I like narratives, and then, narrative television and narrative film sort of follow that. And also I'm in general like very curious about people, and so I think that helps kind of like the clothes become more of a medium, and what you're really doing is storytelling. And so that definitely clicked more. Also, this is a very practical thing that I tell people who are entering into this profession. Is sort of like we're protected by unions, the strike. And, I wasn't really ready when I got out of school to be someone who wasn't able to sort of pay off their loans because they were a struggling artist, and with costuming, it's like sort of you do have like sort of a base living wage that you could, work with, and job security and health insurance. And I think all those things are very important, and nobody ever sort of talks about it in terms of profession decisions,
Sure. I read this Indie Wire article about you and your work in Beef. And, I thought you brought a really, the quotes in the article were really, really interesting. And I thought you brought, I guess, your art background would explain. I thought you had a great philosophical approach. You talked here, you said, I love this. This is your quote. You said, the Instagrams where it's like beige and there's an object and a shadow and there might be a plant? Well, that's Amy. That's sort of her identity, as opposed to Naomi. Her Instagram, she's like on a yacht. It's all sorts of vacation Instagrams. So even for two people who wear similar color palettes, they can have very different projection. I loved
Yeah.
that approach, and this article was actually really, really interesting. And
Hmm.
I love that you have a sort of a artistic and philosophical approach to your work,
Hmm.
which I thought was unique. And is that
Hmm.
something that you developed over time, or has that always been your approach to costume design?
Yeah, I think it developed over time. When you first get into the industry, you're sort of building sort of what you like. And um, I think, a lot of times people don't talk about like, I view costume design as a craft. It's something older, because crafts, people don't talk about that anymore. And I think the more you do, the more you develop sort of your own personal point of view when you're working on a craft, and it takes years actually. But again, I was always curious about like human stories. When I was younger, I really wanted to be an archaeologist, and so like for me, like I said, clothing is a medium, so you sort of have to understand the whole person. Is where I come from. So the objects that they have in their homes, Instagram is a great way to talk about how it's a tool for people to sort of project themselves now versus when people didn't have them, and it's easily accessible to all. And so for me, it's sort of about understanding their surroundings, understanding how they project themselves to other people, and those are the important things. And then when you get into the clothes, it's another sort of like um, sort of puzzle that you have to figure out. But the
Sure.
main thing is to understand the narrative of the person, which is kind of like what an actor does when they get into character, right? So I try to look at a lot of images and sort of think of different ways into this character that can make them more interesting. And I also have this theory, and just like this idea that life is always more interesting than fiction, and so you really do have to look at life a lot to get to the most interesting point of this person.
Well, yeah, and you go on in this article and you say, this is a quote you had said, I'm always looking for places in costume where you can stretch and make it a little bit off and weird and have that undercurrent
Yeah.
and the tension on screen. For me, Ali Wong's character is doing all these terrible things, and she has this undercurrent of dissatisfaction and rage, but her public persona is very calm, very curated, very put together. I thought that was really,
Yeah.
I just loved hearing you say these kinds of things, because I think
Hmm.
that kind of approach to costume design can only really enhance the film or the
Hmm.
TV show that you're watching. Um,
Yeah.
Look, I think everything needs a philosophy behind it. Now,
Yes, me too.
I mean, I think that always makes film and television better. Now,
Hmm.
when you begin working on a project, do you begin with the script? Do you begin with the actor? Where does your
Uh-huh.
process begin?
I usually It's always the script, but also I tend to ask the director, whoever's directing it, if they have a pitch deck, because it's sort of learning the philosophy of
That's
the
interesting.
overview of what they're trying to achieve. I also ask the DP, what their deck looks like, and so does the production designer, because all these things are interlinked in sort of like the summary of what you're trying to do. And costume design, filmmaking, it's collaborative art, so you have to know what the end goal is on top of the script and the writing, because you could think of one thing when you're reading the script, but depending on the filmmaker, it could be drastically different in how they approach it visually. And so I think it's very important for someone to really understand it. And then when you get into character, you sort of have to really talk to the actor, make sure they're comfortable, see what their process is and their point of view is, to sort of integrate what you're thinking in with them. Um, Usually, I find that that's the best way, because then the actor's very confident when they start acting in the clothes and being in the scene.
Right. And I thought it was really interesting the fact that you went from a show like Station 11, which is sort of post-apocalyptic, dystopian, if you
Yeah.
will, theatrical as
Uh-huh.
well, and then you
Yeah.
jumped over to Beef. Was your approach
Mhm.
to something like Station 11, was it significantly different than how you approached your work in Beef?
I think yes. But at the core it's sort of the same. You're sort of looking for the foundation is always truth. So you're also like I said, I'm very interested in people and cultures, and so I always try to find the truth that's in how people would evolve and deal with situations, you know. And then aesthetically, you know, obviously Station is very different, but that does come with conversations with the creator. And also with Station, you know, I usually tend to have you know, when you talk about philosophies, I usually tend to have like a bigger philosophy in terms of working on my craft of what I want out of each project. So obviously I'm in service to the project, but on my end for my craft, there are things that I would want to work on. So for example, Station 11 was about art and it was about experimentation. And so I really went to it from that point of view.
Mm,
Beef, I was trying to make it so it's this very heightened reality in terms of contemporary costumes.
sure.
And so I went into it with that. Um, and so with each, you know, project that I do, you know, you sort of try to work on what I think is what I need to become better and better as I design. And so, you know, on top of everything, I think for me personally, there's this like undercurrent of, you know, understanding that and what I want to get out of each project.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fan. I was a fan of your work. I loved what you did on Get Shorty. I really loved the TV
Thank
series. I thought it was great, and it looked like that was with the different kinds of contemporary characters.
you.
It was, plus I'd seen the original movie. I actually read the book, so I was
Hmm. Hmm.
very excited for the show, and I love that show. And when you're
Yeah.
working, you know, a show like Get Shorty or Station 11, you get to work with a pretty large ensemble. I mean, in terms of like,
Hmm.
whereas Beef, you've got two real central characters. I mean, there's obviously other
Yeah.
people in the show, but do you prefer working on ensemble shows, or do you have a different approach if there's really two main characters front and center? How do you approach or do you not approach them in different ways?
Well, I mean, like for me, if you have an ensemble, I tend to think of it as like a tableau. So like sort of how they're working in a scene together, and sort of what you're trying to get emotively out of the scene from the group of people. And usually when there's a group of people, it's like you're focused on whatever their subculture is within that
Sure.
group and how they kind of work together. When there's two people, I or like very big central characters, I try to think of them as um, sort of like the apex, and everyone else revolves around them. So the point of that is so like Beef, it's everyone else has to connectively make sense to what they look like and what their world point of view is. For example, you know, Amy being the main character, George is in her orbit, right? So George has to connect with her visually. He does have his own sort of aesthetic qualities happening, but it has to sort of link up to her. Whereas Paul is the same thing with Danny, and so the worlds have to be very clear when there's two central characters. So it's not that much more different. It's just, you know, I have to think about what sort of accomplishes it, the show and the moments as a whole, you know, with both of these things.
Right, absolutely. And you know, again, I go back to this IndieWire article. It really
Hmm.
cracked me up about how you went and got some vintage clothes for Steven's character,
Oh
and
yeah.
there were some really fun choices that you made that just cracked me
Uh-huh.
up reading about it. How did you
Uh-huh.
settle upon like what, the Nautica jacket, something like that?
Oh
You know,
yeah. So that's a very Korean dad thing. And, you know, we didn't go into it being like, this is an Asian show, you know, we have to sort of, from that perspective, we went into it being like, this is a character and we do want to stay truthful to how he grew up and things like that. And so we did choose a Nautica jacket because a lot of Koreans, wore Nautica.
Right.
We did sort of understand who he is regionally, because Asians are different regionally in LA. Like
Right.
if you're
Sure.
from the Valley, you're different than Asians in the city, in Los Angeles. It's very sort of micro subcultures, and so we were really trying to get that right with the brands. And the reason why I thrifted everything was mostly because you can never substitute new things for sort of how those older things work, because they don't make them anymore. So you either have to like remake them, or you have to actually go to a thrift store and thrift them. And we did do a lot of that. And also, with his character, it was a lot of callback to what Steven remembers in terms of, people around him, what Sonny, who's the showrunner, remembers in terms of the people around him. So it was a lot of working from collective memory to dress him.
Oh, I just thought those choices you made were great. I mean, getting the Dickies and all that stuff. I thought that was, and again, that brings a kind of authenticity to what you're watching
Mhm.
that maybe someone like myself as a viewer might not understand. But your community, the Asian community of Los Angeles would be like, somebody was really paying attention and got it right. And I think that those kinds of details are really what set things apart. So often, I mean, I watch a lot of contemporary television,
Mm-hmm.
and the clothes kind of seem off. Like, I don't, if this makes any
Mm-hmm.
sense, I don't believe them. Like, I'm a big fan of movies of the
Yeah.
'70s. When you watch like
Yeah.
grungy New York movies of the '70s,
Yeah.
everyone's wearing clothes that you believe in. Like, they
Yeah.
seem real. These days, I see a lot of stuff that looks like it was just picked up off the rack, and it
Yeah.
was, and it gets in the way of my ability to believe.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And I think it comes from, sometimes we try to make people look too good because people in life
Yeah.
actually don't look as good as film. But also, if you really think about what's in a person's closet, people don't have new things all the time, and especially people who don't shop, they could have clothes that are like 20 years old and they
Right.
just keep wearing them. And so, like, you have to sort of pay attention to those sort of psychological details. For me, it's very much about psychological details. Like, if you don't buy clothes, I'm not going to put you in new clothes. It doesn't make any sense. And visually, I think, can, just really distract the audience. So I understand what you're coming from. It is a harder process to get sort of that nuance going, but I do think it's really worth it.
Yeah, no, I do too. And when, I mean, it might not be something you're aware of, but psychologically, I think subtextually you kind of
Yeah.
are, and
Yeah.
it's funny. I think about very detail oriented film directors, people like Ridley
Hmm.
Scott, where
Yeah.
clothing, you look at something like Blade Runner, of course, from 40 years ago,
Yeah.
that set a tone, and the clothes were, it wasn't just surface, they had layers to them, 3 and 4
Yeah.
layers deep of clothes,
Yeah.
and you really felt it. And I
Yeah.
love those kinds of clothes. I mean, I love clothes that, whether it's, contemporary, modern, I like clothes that are not necessarily literally layered, but the
Yeah.
layer, you know what I mean? Like to
Yeah.
have, and you feel it, and it helps the character, and it probably helps the actors too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it really does. And a lot of them really, want to be a part of the process. But yeah, I'm a firm believer. I use a lot of thrifted and vintage stuff. I never try to use all new stuff, um, just because yeah, it's what you're saying. It doesn't really look completely believable. So
Right. And that's a hard
yeah.
thing to try and explain to somebody. You kind of either
Yeah.
know it or not. Like, how, going to art school, going to art center, my girlfriend teaches at
Hmm.
art center now. She teaches,
Oh, it's a shame.
yeah,
Great.
she's there. She graduated from there, and now she's at Claremont getting her master's, but she's teaching in
Hmm.
fine arts. How
Hmm.
do you feel that you're that kind of having more of a rigorous academic fine arts background? How did that help you move into costume design?
I think it helped me think better, because when you do sort of painting classes and you do analysis, it's much more about a philosophy, a thought, a pondering maybe, and then
Mm,
you sort of use your medium to sort of execute it, and your final product needs to say something about that. And for me, I feel like that's immensely helpful in the work I do, because like I said, there's always an overview of something that I want to do, and then everything else is sort of trying to understand the execution of it, and sort of understanding the end goal that you would want to have visually. But also, I think it helps me keep my mind open. I'm always looking at movies and thinking of characters and the worlds that they live in, and trying to be like, we've seen this multiple times on this many shows,
Mm-hmm.
like, or this many movies. Maybe we could think of this person differently, and how can we challenge the viewer into sort of not being like, oh, monochromatic dark equals villain. Like, I
Right.
really tend to really try to buck against the grain on those type of things. But I think that comes from having an art background and an education where you're always sort of asking questions and sort of reacting to the past. And so that's the way I view movies in general. So yeah, like I said, I don't really think a lot of times, like, I have to understand clothes and I have to understand people, but a lot of things that I sort of want to do have sort of bigger concepts to them. And that's the type of projects I seek too, is the people that would allow me to do that.
Well, you spoke of tableaus earlier, like
Mhm.
working on something like Station 11. Definitely
Yeah.
all the clothes create a tableau throughout the show
Yeah.
with all the different characters. When you're designing for a show like Station 11, are you thinking in terms of the overall tableau, what it's all going to look
Hmm.
like, or is it still about the individual? Are you going for an overall look, or does
Yeah.
each character get sort of an individual? How do you approach that?
Well, with Station 11, it was very, I think some of the thought process, because Station 11 is actually unlike it's like every sci-fi. There's a
Yeah.
lot of world building. And so you do have to think of like how different sort of societies work, right? Because if, in Station 11, everyone was wiped out. And so I was thinking like the theater troupe is the most creative, sort of group, and they project themselves creatively. So they want to dress creatively. And
Yeah.
within that, we try to find the personality of everyone. In contrast, the people who were at the airport, we were thinking they were more of a commune type society. And they were quite fearful of the outside world. And so for me, the end goal for them, actually, I was just like, they should kind of look like a 90s Gap ad, sort of like cohesive and but pared back and not essentially creative. And then that's why when the troupe comes in and performs, it's such an exciting thing for them. But I do like to sort of regulate people into worlds when I do world building, and then you sort of work on the individual context of how they exist in that world. So I think with everything, it's like but especially with world building, it's like macro and then you go micro.
Right. Right. Okay. I mean, that's very interesting to me, that kind of an approach. So
Hmm.
when when you're approaching a new project, and you jump from,
Hmm.
say, science fiction to comedy,
Hmm.
do you have to put yourself in a different mindset, or are all genres do you approach all genres the same?
I think it's sometimes it's different. So I think, with science fiction, because I'm very interested in sci-fi, and science fiction is one of my favorite genres. And then I do love fantasy.
Sure.
Um, but I think within those contexts, I think there's something about what people are expecting when they see it.
Mm.
And sometimes when you work with that, you do have to say you're working on something like with Blade Runner, there's like a legacy. And so you do have to work within the confines of a legacy. But if with Station, it was something very new. And so we did want to create something where it it spoke about maybe how complacent sometimes science fiction is in terms of
Mm.
like their aesthetic quality, to where they sort of recycle things that have established that DNA before. So, things like Star Wars or things like Star Trek. It's almost as if in in other science fictions, it's like you kind of sort of recycle that DNA.
Sure.
But Station was really trying to surprise people, and so we didn't try to do that. And also recycle post-apocalyptic DNA, you know. And then when you go into something like Beef, even though it's a comedy, it's like a dark comedy. And so for me, it's a little bit more freeing because you're not really trying to say anything about the particular genre that you're working in. You're sort of working in uh, from just like a natural sort of storytelling point of view, because comedies can look a range of different ways, you know.
Sure.
And so maybe that's why there's like a slight difference. But again, with everything, I try to find the most interesting aspect of it and just hope that, you know, my collaborators, you know, the producers and the directors would want to go in that weirder direction, you know.
Sure. Well, I'm curious. I always ask this, you know, for people who want to get into costume design, would you recommend an academic art school background, or would you think a more practical? What would you say to people that are interested in getting into costume design now?
I would say have an education like anywhere. Like don't it doesn't, you know, I think if you're doing costume design and all you could think about is costume design and fashion are very different.
Right.
So if you want to go into fashion, don't come into fashion costume design. It's very, very different. Um, and I think in general, if you have an education in anything, if you're just like in general curious about the world or you love films, any of those things can help you become a better costume designer, because you know clothes don't mean anything without human context, and so you have to understand what human context is. You have to understand like what good story is. So I would say like read a lot, watch a lot of film, understand history, just have different interests than clothes
Sure.
would round you out, like have more of a dimension when you get into this field. The other thing I would say is, you know, what people don't know a lot is like like when you costume design, it's a lot of managing, like managing producers, directors, managing your staff, managing timelines. And so it does help if a person, you know, what school does, it helps you manage your time better, it helps you structure things better and understand problem solving. And I think those are all skills that are very valuable in costume design. And
Sure.
so that's why I would think like just if you just have an education, it does help with everything when you enter into it, you know.
Good. That's good to know. Now, I wanted to ask you before we conclude one thing about, you know, we're a lot of people that watch these shows love superhero movies and TV. They're big, and I know I've noticed because it's on the IMDb, as you said. You're working on the Penguin series, which is a spinoff of Matt Reeves' The Batman. Now, I know you can't talk about it, but I would ask more of a philosophical question. If you're working on a show like The Penguin, a TV version of the movie, there's already a very set, well, they've given you, you're coming into a project after, I guess it was kind of the same for maybe American Horror Story, but every season it's different. But there's already an aesthetic that was established in the film, a beautiful
Yeah.
aesthetic. So when
Yeah.
you come into a project like The Penguin, are you given leeway? Can you bring your own creative imprimatur, or does what was done in the movie loom large over what you're doing on the show?
There are certain elements, you know, obviously on projects like this that you have to stay true to what was done. And so you do have to understand visually what they did in the original movie and sort of work within that context. Now, while you're working within that context, um, it depends on the director or the showrunner, you know, or whoever's dictating, because you know, I feel like in every movie, you know, even in something like this where there's a legacy, there's like one, two, and possibly three, is more like there's always a point of view that they're looking to expand, you
Sure.
know? And I think that's what they want you to do, because they're trying to go from one project to another, working within the context of what has been done, but also expand it, because that's what makes, trilogies and things exciting. You
Yes.
show them a new part of the world, or you show them, people that they haven't seen before, or if you're shooting at night, you shoot during day. It's all about expansion. So yes, in a way, you do have to work within the context of what's been done, but also, they're hiring you because you have a perspective that you could bring to what they would like to sort of like, sort of continue on and maybe expand on. And so I think that's what I would say to that, is just like, like, don't be afraid to work within limits, because sometimes I feel like it produces great product. It gives you parameters and it's a challenge, and I think it's good for the individual to sort of work that way, like that sometimes too.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking like on a show, if you really think about it, we only saw the penguin in the movie at work. He was always
Yeah.
working. Like if he golfs,
Mhm.
what does the penguin wear to the golf course? I mean, you
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like, or if he's going to a
Yeah.
party, like a cocktail party, how would he dress? Because we only ever saw
Yeah.
him
Yeah.
being the penguin at his club or whatever.
Yeah.
And now
Yeah.
I'm not saying there, for those of you at home, I'm not insinuating there's some great golf scene in the penguin. That's not what I mean. I was just using that as an example. Unless he's like Goldfinger. There's a great moment where
Mhm.
James Bond and Goldfinger play golf. I don't think that we're going to see that in the Penguin. But if we did, you'd have to, because they didn't show us that in the movie. So
Yeah.
you are given that kind of creative leeway. Well, listen, can
Yeah.
people find you? Do you have a presence on social media?
Yes, I think on Instagram I'm Helly Huang, HellYHuang. My friend set it up for me, so I
Helly
sometimes I
Juan.
forget the name of it. Yeah. And my website is Helen Huang Costumes, but I haven't updated it, very recently. But yeah, those are sort of like the where I'm more present in. But yeah, it's social media is kind of scary sometimes. The engagement to me, it seems very complicated. So I,
Well,
I
yeah,
tend to I tend to post to promote things, but it's harder for me to now, uh, just sort of do that.
sure. Well, sure. No, I totally understand. Well, Helen Juan, it's been great to speak with you today, and I very much appreciate your time here on the Designing Hollywood podcast. And what do you have? Can you talk about anything else that you have coming on or beyond the Penguin, or is there anything you've worked on that hasn't come out yet?
No, this is pretty up to date. I have something, but I can't really speak of it at this moment.
Sure.
But if it does happen, we'll see what happens with the strike, right? If it does happen, it would be
Right.
very exciting for me. But nothing's certain now because of the strike. So
Sure. Sure. Well, listen, I want to thank you for being here and thank you for giving up your time today. And it's been great to speak with you.
it was so great speaking with you too. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And a very special thanks to our sponsor, International Silks and Woolens. ISW has what you need. Over 14,000 square feet of fabrics, notions, and drapery. Their large selection of over 100,000 fabrics includes theatrical, woolens, notions, bridal, cotton, drapery, and designer. ISW is eminent for the theatrical department, which is considered to be the largest in the United States. Whether you're looking for the perfect material for a special occasion or vintage material for a big budget Hollywood movie, you will find it here at International Silks and Woolens. A special thank you to founder and executive producer Martika Ibarra, co-founder, costume designer, the legendary Marilyn Vance, and of course, John Campea from The John Campea Show. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tune in to the audio version wherever you listen to podcasts. I am, of course, your host, Robert Meyer Burnett, and you can find me on Instagram at rmburnett, or find me on Twitter at BurnettRM, or on YouTube at PostGeekSingularity. Thanks very much. Like, subscribe, and give us your comments. What would you like to see on the channel? Right down below. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode of Designing Hollywood.